Hey, greetings, everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Alan West here, the Executive Director of the American Constitutional Rights Union, and welcome to another episode of Live Free TV. You know, it was the thing that the left has been going forward against President Donald Trump for quite some time, former President Trump, to try to get him in the court, to try to get that label of a convicted felon. And what we saw happen in the trial in New York, the quote unquote Stormy Daniels case, was really a travesty of justice. And I can think no one better to talk about this than Kenin Spivak, who is a businessman, lawyer, and a writer for National Review and the Claremont Institute American Mind. Kenin, thanks for joining us here at Live Free TV.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You know, you've already started to see it on all of the leftist media outlets. And from what I understand, you also have a commercial ad from the Biden campaign. You know, Donald Trump is now a convicted felon. Do you think that is a proper, title or accusation to lay against President Trump, looking at the really aspects of this trial where there were so many unconstitutional things done, flaws in justice that were done?
Well, there's so many different ways of answering that question. First, of all the criminal charges leveled against the former president, the ones in New York were by far the most absurd. They were clearly farcical, complete absence of due process, complete absence of anyone ever in the history of New York ever being charged with crimes like this based on similar facts. I mean, we could go through all the things that were wrong with the prosecution, with the prosecutor, with the judge in that case. You want one really little, almost cute aside. No, he's not yet a convicted felon until the sentencing occurs and there's a formal entry of the judgment. He's not yet a convicted felon. But even when they can call him that, it's a farce.
So let's talk about it. Let's try to unpack it for our viewers. You know, first and foremost, this was a case that the Federal Elections Commission had already passed on. Am I correct with that?
The Federal Elections Commission had passed on it. The U.S. attorney for the district that encompasses New York had passed on it. Bragg's predecessor, Cyrus Vance Jr., had passed on it. And Alvin Bragg had passed on it. And only because of the intense pressure put on him by the far left residents of New York did he come back around and bring a case that he knows he never should have brought.
So when you also look at it, it's not just the fact that no one wanted to touch this case because they didn't, I guess, see a lot of credibility to it, but it was long past the statute of limitations also.
Yeah, well, let's look at what he did. There is a misdemeanor in New York for false records. That's for creating false financial records. It's a misdemeanor. It has a 2-year statute of limitations. It can have a very short jail sentence of up to a few months, but it's a misdemeanor. He decided that because Donald Trump and his companies had entered in their internal entry for the payments to Michael Cohen, his lawyer, they'd entered legal expense instead of entering repayment of hush money for Stormy Daniels, that was false records. Now, that's a discussion in and of itself, but the statute had expired. But there was a part of this statute which said, if you can argue, if you can prove that he did this false record keeping to further a second crime, then the statute is extended and it's a felony. So he found another misdemeanor for which the statute of limitations had expired, this New York statute about interfering in an election, put them together and came up with this felony. You know, the second statute, which really is about election fraud, it's a federal offense. You can't bring this in New York where it was a federal election. We can go through it. There was no fraud. You know, what Alvin Bragg was trying to argue that in 2016, Trump wasn't really elected. It was a fraud. I thought we're supposed to not like Donald Trump because he said in 2020 there was fraud, but it's okay for Alvin Bragg to say it about 2016?
Yeah, it's interesting because what you're basically saying is they took misdemeanors, upgraded to a felony against something where really, okay, a local jurisdiction, they tried to make this into a federal felony case, but it just doesn't match. And furthermore, do you think that there is other, examples of this happening? I mean, I can kind of think of John Edwards, who, kind of paid off some money. I can think about Bill Clinton, who paid off some individuals as well. Why is there this two-tier system of justice? It's a rhetorical question, but I'd like to get your perspective.
Well, first of all, those other cases were federal cases, and
Yes.
maybe someone made a federal case out of them, but they were brought in federal court. This New York statute might have allowed Bragg to do what he did if Trump had interfered in a New York state election, not a federal election. And even then, no one in New York has ever been charged with this kind of crime for filling in his checking account wrong. And, even if we pretend, and we really would have to pretend, that Bragg had the right to bring these charges, the reports of what was filled in that checking account were going to be made public in 2017. The election was in 2016. So even if he had the right to bring the charges, there was no fraud. That's why he passed on this case the first time, and that's why everyone else passed on it. For Edwards and for Clinton, those were federal charges, federal courts. Last point, here's why everyone passed on it. What Trump basically did was he had or allegedly had an affair with Stormy Daniels, had or allegedly had an affair with Karen McDougal. And he paid off Stormy Daniels allegedly through Michael Cohen, and he knew about payments that were made to McDougal. Those are the allegations. But none of that's an election fraud because none of those payments are election payments. If he
Mhm.
had tried to book them as election payments, then the FEC would have gone after him. That's what they went after Edwards for, booking private payoffs as election payments.
Let's talk about violations of former President Trump's constitutional rights. When you look at this gag order that was placed upon him, it seems to me very questionable that you would issue such a gag order against, a leading presidential candidate and also a former president.
I agree. I think, yeah, the constitutionality of the initial gag order is in the gray area. Maybe it was constitutional, but it was unwise and really unnecessary. The some of the other gag orders, like the gag order that federal prosecutor Jack Smith is trying to get in the Florida case, the Mar-a-Lago case,
Mhm.
that's unconstitutional, and that's why he didn't get that gag order. This New York gag order in the gray area.
Yeah. So let's talk now when we look at all of the things that were very questionable about this quote unquote trial. Judge Marchant and the fact that, should he really have recused himself or is that falls within a gray area?
Oh, I don't think it's in the gray area at all.
Okay.
Here's an individual whose daughter is a reasonably high level Democrat operative who's responsible for TV advertising and we'll call it PR, public relations activities based on the trial and based on getting Donald Trump. And then Judge Merchant himself gave us a very small amount of money, $35, to a campaign specifically intended to get Donald Trump out of the election, and he gave other small amounts to Joe Biden. Why did he give such small amounts? Well, I don't know what his financial affairs are,
Mhm.
but at the very least, he was virtue signaling to the Democrats and to the progressives that he was on their side. If a judge feels it's necessary to give $35 so he can virtue signal, it's equally necessary that he recuse himself if he finds himself in the first case ever, criminal case ever brought against a former president of the United States. I don't think that was in the gray area.
Now, when we look at his orders that he gave to the jury, they seemed very convoluted and it seemed to be a catch all type of directive from the judge. Are we correct in that assessment?
Yeah, I don't think his orders were in the gray area. Let's go back and start with the fact that the indictment didn't include election fraud because Bragg knew he couldn't bring an election fraud case.
Mhm.
There's a federal and a New York State constitutional requirement that a defendant have adequate notice of the charges. As the case proceeded, they said that they were going to use this New York statute, but they were never clear about what they were going to say Donald Trump had done to interfere in this election, though most of their case was about the hush money payments. So I suppose Trump had some notice about it. It's not until closing argument that they said, well, maybe it was a tax fraud, and maybe he falsified some more documents, and maybe it was an election fraud. The judge, in his instructions to the jury, never required them to unanimously find what it is that Trump had done to violate this New York statute. The judge said, well, if you think he did anything that was illegal and that's good enough, just vote that he violated the New York statute. That's not the way our system works.
Yeah.
Federal election law requires a willful, knowing willful violation. Judge never instructed the jury on the willfulness standard. Judge allowed into trial uh, David Pecker, the president of the parent company of
Mhm.
National Enquirer, and Michael Cohen testifying about what election law permitted and didn't permit. These are not experts on election law, but he wouldn't permit Donald Trump to introduce a former chairman of the Federal Elections Commission to explain election law. He allowed Stormy Daniels, who had never claimed this before, ever, to testify that her sex with Donald Trump may have been non consensual. Stormy Daniels shouldn't even have been a witness in this trial. This wasn't a trial about whether Stormy Daniels had sex with Donald Trump. If anything, it was about whether Donald Trump had paid Stormy Daniels and how he recorded it in his checking account. So this judge allowed in all sorts of prejudicial information, didn't allow Donald Trump to develop his defense, had the oddest, improper instructions to the jury at the end. And I don't think any of this is in the gray area.
Now we're going into the sentencing phase, which will be next month, kind of early in the month of July. What is your assessment on what Judge Marchand will end up deciding as far as the sentencing? I don't believe in my heart of hearts you're going to sentence a former president into prison because I think, first of all, politically that is suicide, and justice-wise, it just does not make sense whatsoever. So, where do you see this sentencing coming down?
I agree with you. As despite all the bad things I said about Judge Merchant, I think he'll draw the line someplace. First, Alvin Bragg has a policy in New York County, which is Manhattan, New York City, of not seeking incarceration for what's called a Class E felony, a nonviolent Class E felony, which is the lowest level of felony, which is what Trump was convicted of. Second, if you look at convictions for Class E felonies and some related convictions, the defendants did not get jail time. I think it's unlikely that Trump is sentenced to jail time. I think it's unlikely he's sentenced to even 30 or 60 in confinement. I think it's likely that should he be sentenced even to 30 days of home confinement, that it stayed pending his appeal. Maybe I still believe in the justice system enough to think that Merchant will sentence him to a fine or maybe a I don't know, anger management classes or some ridiculous thing like that.
Something innocuous that he can still come back and say. Because I think what the left got out of this was, as you just properly adjudicated, trying to say he's a convicted felon, but that is based upon the sentencing. But they're still going to go with that line anyhow, regardless. Let's switch over and talk about the other two cases that he's involved in. Do you think that the Robert Hur report, where he sat down with President Biden, and of course Merrick Garland is stonewalling that discovery of the tape to the Congress, to the Oversight Committee, but do you think that what Hur came out with, saying that Joe Biden was guilty of improperly having classified material, but we're not going to bring forth charges to take him to a trial? How can you try Jack Smith to push forward this against a former president who is authorized to have classified information?
Well, first, let's go. It's interesting in Hur. Really, the only way that he shouldn't be, well, he can't try Biden while he's in office. But the reason to not try him, other than he's now in office, would be because he was mentally deficient at the time he took the classified information, not because he's mentally deficient now,
Hmm.
but I guess it is whatever it is nowadays. Uh, the Mar-a-Lago case has some elements to it that are a bit troubling.
Mhm.
It's true that Donald Trump had the right to declassify documents, but there really isn't evidence that he did so. Undoubtedly, Mar-a-Lago is selective prosecution. Undoubtedly, Trump a bit brought this on himself by not just giving some of these documents back. And undoubtedly, it now appears that the FBI and the Justice Department tampered with the evidence.
Mm.
So it seems we have a lot of people who are all somewhat wrong. Uh, I would have preferred that Trump gave back the documents. We have a good judge in that case. She's looking at both sides. It's difficult to predict what the outcome will be, but it certainly won't occur for quite some time until after the election.
Let's go down to the place of my birth, Fulton County, Georgia, and let's look at Fannie Willis. It has been more sideshow antics surrounding that district attorney. Do you see any real merit of the case down there in Fulton County, Georgia?
The case against Donald Trump, no. I think the case against Donald Trump is very caught up in the First Amendment and may get caught up in some of the immunity. We'll know more about that in the next week or two when the Supreme Court rules, because the case against Donald Trump largely has to do with things he said on the phone. In the case of some of his co-defendants who are accused of actually filing false records or calling people up and pretending to be people that they're not, those cases may have a little bit more substance to it as very low-level felonies or high-level misdemeanors.
Without a doubt, do you really see that all of these cases being more of a political nature than really a justice or legal nature?
Oh, absolutely. Even if Fannie Willis has a bit of a case, it would never have been brought against anyone else. Bragg's case never would have been brought against anyone else and never has been. The so-called civil case, I say so-called because it was fashioned as a civil case, but the case in front of Judge Engeron in New York that
Mhm.
Letitia James brought for fraud had a penalty far worse than a criminal case. They wanted to take away all his businesses and fine him $450 million. No case like that has ever been brought in the state of New York. That was a political case. The Jack Smith Washington case is a purely political case. The only case that has even a smidgen of substance to it is the Mar-a-Lago case. And even that one would not have been brought but for the politics.
So, in closing, when you look at where we are today, do you think that the left has any regret about going down this lawfare path? Because I don't think they've gotten the desired results that they thought they were going to get.
The far progressive left has no reservations. They want to do anything they can to Trump. The left of center left has to be regretting this. They started with their weakest case, the case that even a lot of Democrats thought was a farce. Uh, Donald Trump has raised more money than he ever had before in this cycle. He sees his polls rising. It was a terrible mistake. And the other cases are going to be pushed off past the election. And the Georgia case, whatever you may think of what Trump did or didn't do, Fannie Willis has not presented well in that case.
So, in closing, what do you think that the American people should be most attuned to going forward with all of this, background, trials, sentencing and everything? How should the American people stay focused and be able to sift through all of the white noise out there?
On the Democrat side, you have people who are doing their best to destroy the American judicial system, the principles on which this country is based, to weaponize the legal system against a former president, and by the way, many of the people who work with him. Against him, you have a person, Donald Trump, who the Democrats claim wants to destroy democracy. But look at what he did when he was president. Never, not once was he accused of going after someone that he shouldn't have, or was the Justice Department accused of going after anyone it shouldn't have. The man who supposedly wants to destroy democracy believes in democracy, believes in the rule of law, and believes in the justice system. Given the balance between the two, one says mean things, the other one lately says mean things as well. I think that's what the takeaway should be.
Well, Kenin Spivak, I want to thank you so very much for your time. How can people follow you and keep up with all of your writings and your assessments?
A lot of my articles are at americamind.org, which is the American Mind. And then I also have a lot of writings at National Review um, and RCP, Real Clear Politics. So they can Google my name, and if they are interested, they can read what I have to say. If they're not interested, that's okay too.
No, we want people to be interested, and I want to thank you for taking the time because it's so important that people understand, these things from a very simple assessment and perspective and analysis, and that's what you've given us. Because I think the better we're informed, educated, the better activated we can be. So thank you for being out there and being a guardian of our legal rights and our constitutional rights, which should be synonymous. God bless you, Kenan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Live Free TV. And again, go to theacru.org if you want to learn more about the American Constitutional Rights Union.